This is Isaac. Isaac is a natural scientist, a physicist to be exact. Isaac uses the scientific method to study and solve scientific problems that deal with physics. For example, Isaac recently asked the question, I wonder if heavier objects will fall faster than lighter objects. He then set out to design an experiment to answer this question. In his experiment, he decided to make his independent variable be the time it takes for an object to fall from a certain height, and also to make his dependent variable the heaviness or mass of the object. Every other variable, including the density of the object, would be kept constant. He began his experiment by going to the top of the Empire State Building with two balls, one a marble and the other a bowling ball, each of which were made of the same material. At the top of the building, Isaac dropped both balls at the exact same time, and then timed how long it took for each ball to reach the ground. To his surprise, Isaac found that both hit the ground at the same exact time. How could this be? The bowling ball was obviously heavier than the marble, and yet they both hit the ground at the same time, which means they both fell at the same speed. Isaac could not believe it. To be sure, he repeated his trials 5 more times. However, at the end of all the trials, he found that the results were still the same. Both balls hit the ground at the same time. Through his experimentation using the scientific method, Isaac was able to prove that objects of the same density, regardless of their mass, will fall at the same speed. This is Gregory. Gregory is a human scientist, a psychologist to be exact. Gregory knows of Isaac and aspires to be as successful as Isaac was in the field of the natural sciences, except only in the field of the human sciences. Gregory recently asked himself the question, how do humans react to various forms of humor? Seeing how successful Isaac was in his experimentation using the scientific method, Gregory decided to use the scientific method too. In his experiment, Gregory decided to have 3 levels of humor. These are known as the independent variables. 1. Dark humor, 2. Sarcastic humor, and 3. Corny humor. The plan was to test these different types of humor on human test subjects. For the dependent variable, Gregory decided to simply measure whether or not the person laughed. Because Gregory wanted for his experiment to be able to predict the behavior of all humans everywhere, he decided to have his test subjects be of all different varieties. After searching for test subjects, he settled upon 5 good volunteers: Mark, Sally, Lisa, David, and Lauren. And then he began his experimentation. His experimentation lasted 3 whole days. He tested each subject with a joke from each type of humor and then repeated each trial 5 times using different jokes of the same type to obtain accurate results. To keep as many things as constant as possible, except for anything that had to do with the nature of the subjects, he had each of the jokes pre-recorded so that no variation in his tone of voice or anything else would skew the results. When Gregory was finished, he expected to see an obvious reoccurring trend among the results that he could use to conclude which humor humans found funny. However, this could not be further from the truth. Mark, as it turned out, did not find anything funny at all. Sally laughed only at dark and sarcastic humor and never at corny humor. Lisa laughed only at corny humor, David laughed only at dark humor, and Lauren found everything funny. How could this be? Thought Gregory. And then it occurred to him that the subjects probably had too many unconstants that were causing different results. After each subject attended the post-experimentation reflection meeting that Gregory had planned, he learned that Mark was from Silent Hill, where nothing was funny. Sally was from Gotham City, where everyone was overly sarcastic and dark. Lisa was from Atlantis, where nobody even knew what sarcasm or darkness was. David was from South Park, where everyone was crude, and Lauren was from Hogsmeade, where everything was funny. Gregory was sad about finding out that his experiment had been so flawed, but he did not give up. He decided to design a new experiment where everything was the same as the last experiment, except this time he would aim to make everything constant and use test subjects that were extremely similar. At this stage in his experimentation, Gregory began to wonder if the scientific method, or any scientific approach for that matter, could be used to study humans. After all, in Isaac's experiments, Isaac was able to keep almost every other variable constant with relative ease. In his experiments, however, Gregory had to admit that it was indeed difficult to keep extra variables constant. After searching for test subjects, he settled upon 5 new volunteers: Peter, Stephen, Nathan, Victor, and Edward. Gregory had realized that the scope of his question had been too big last time in trying to predict the nature of the human race as a whole, and so this time he revised his question to be, how do 25-year-old white males from San Francisco, whom all play the same sports, have the same interests, and all of the same IQ level react to various forms of humor. Gregory commenced the experimentation and did everything the same as his previous experiments, except with different subjects. When Gregory was finished with his experimentation, just as he did last time, he expected to see an obvious recurring trend among the results that he could use to make a conclusion about the humor of these select group of men. Again, he was shocked to find out that the results were not in the slightest way similar. Peter laughed only at dark humor, Stephen laughed only at sarcastic humor, Nathan laughed at nothing, Victor laughed only at corny humor, and Edward laughed at everything. Gregory thought to himself, is it possible that there are still an indefinite number of unconstants? Just like previously, after each subject attended the post-experimentation reflection meeting, Gregory learned that Peter had a neglectful father figure growing up, causing him to develop a depressive outlook on life, thus giving him a dark humor. Stephen had a brother that would always make him believe things that were not true, causing him to develop an overly doubtful outlook on life, and thus a sarcastic humor. Nathan, who laughed at nothing, spent too much time on the internet where he had heard all of the jokes before, and consequently laughed at none of them. Victor had spent too much time watching Nickelodeon, where all he was exposed to were corny jokes, and Edward was the only volunteer that had no apparent outliers, to which he responded by laughing a little bit at everything. Shocked by these findings, Gregory set out to try the experiment one more time, this time virtually eliminating all inconstants. For this final attempt, Gregory settled upon 3 volunteers, Nadia, Megan, and Anne, all of whom were identical triplets and coincidentally had the same interests and intelligence. Gregory settled this time for only 3 volunteers, as he thought that since the DNA of all 3 of them were the same, fewer subjects would be needed to produce accurate results. After all, what could possibly differentiate these 3 people with the same DNA? Now that Gregory was sure that the subjects all were the same age, gender, race, location, interest, intelligence, and most importantly background, he felt confident that his experiment would yield a conclusive result. After performing the experiment exactly as he did in the past 2 attempts, Gregory yielded the following results. Nadia laughed only at corny jokes, Megan laughed only at sarcastic jokes, and Anne laughed at everything. After they all attended the post-experimentation reflection meeting, Gregory learned that despite the subjects being the most similar subjects on Earth, they had developed unconstants in a way not unlike the butterfly effect. The butterfly effect is a theory that when a butterfly lands on a leaf on one side of the world, it causes an earthquake on the other. Nadia, on the way to the experiment, saw a fly land on her windshield, which caused her to look to the right, see a dog walking, and then think about a corny joke she once had heard about dogs, thus setting her otherwise neutral preference to a preference of corny jokes. Megan had caught a traumatic case of the flu at the age of 7 by standing too close to someone sneezing. Her twin sisters had not caught it because they were standing behind her. This flu then caused her to develop a slightly pessimistic outlook on life, and thus giving her a dark humor. Anne was the only one who had not experienced random events and thus laughed at everything. After all this, Gregory finally accepted the fact that he would not be able to achieve a perfect testing environment where all the variables were kept constant. Unfortunately, Gregory had not come up with a conclusion for his experiment. However, he had come up with the conclusion that the scientific method cannot be used successfully for studying and predicting the behavior of humans simply because there are too many random variables. This is Daniel Simmons. Daniel is an actual psychologist from Harvard University. In 1998, Daniel asked himself the question, how aware of change are humans of their environments? He then set out with 3 of his colleagues to design an experiment using the scientific method to answer this question. In his experiment, an actor came up to a pedestrian and asked for directions. While the pedestrian was giving directions, 2 men carrying a large wooden door walked between the actor and the pedestrian, completely blocking their view of each other for several seconds. During that time, the actor was replaced by another actor, one of a different height and build, and with a different outfit, haircut, and voice. More than half of the participants did not notice the change. The experiment was one of the first to illustrate the phenomenon of change blindness, which shows just how selective we are about what we take in from any given visual. Simmons' experiment utilized a scientific method to study human behavior. His independent variable was the actor that was swapped with another actor, and his dependent variable was whether or not the participants noticed the change. Just like all other proper experiments using the scientific method, Simmons did repeated trials to gain more accurate results. Unlike Gregory's experiment, this one actually illustrated a trend to which the experiment could then be deemed successful. A possible reason as to why the scientific method was applicable in Simmons' experiment and not Gregory's is that the dependent variable in Gregory's experiment, human preference, was too subjective and was too susceptible to random error. Simmons' study was able to yield successful results using a scientific approach because the dependent variable in his experiment was based on natural tendencies or naturally occurring flaws, if you will, that were unlikely to have been affected by genetics, personal preference, or any other variable that had caused skewed data in Gregory's experiment.
Well, we're down here somewhere, aren't we?
Yeah, you see, 22.
Oops, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. Try the 22. Try the... Yeah. If you keep going that way,
Okay. Last time I switched with someone who looked a little bit like me, but where's the fun in that?
Oh.
You know who best direct you? The other side.
You see that church down there?
Yep, straight through there.
And then you keep going down.
Sorry.
Sorry, which way? You see where that church is down there?
Yeah.